Hello friends, today we see different components of IC engine and their functions. Here is a systematic diagram of IC engine components and we see here the main parts of IC engine: cylinder and cylinder liner. This is the first component. The function of this component is to retain the working fluid such as mixture of air and petrol in petrol engine, or air and diesel in case of diesel engine. It will also guide the piston. Next component is piston ring or gudgeon pin. It will transmit the force developed due to gas pressure inside the combustion chamber to the crankshaft through the connecting rod. Connecting rod, it will transmit the reciprocating motion of the piston to the rotary motion of the crankshaft. Next, crankshaft, crank and crank wheel. It will convert reciprocating motion into rotary motion and transmit this rotary motion power to the outside source like belt drive, gear drive, or maybe the chain drive. The next important component of IC engine, that is valve gearing mechanism. Whatever the opening and closing of inlet and exhaust valve, it is done by this mechanism inside the combustion chamber. So proper opening and closing of inlet and exhaust valve, it is very important for the engine performance. So whatever the engine performance, it is depends on the opening and closing timing of the valve. So valve gearing mechanism, this is also one more component, important component of IC engine. Now we see one by one all these components and their functions, their construction. First component, it is cylinder and cylinder liner. As we discussed, its function is to retain the working fluid such as mixture of air and petrol in petrol engine or air and diesel in diesel engine. It will also guide the piston. Combustion of fuel takes place inside the engine cylinder, and we know that very high temperature rise in the engine cylinder in the combustion chamber, and when there is a high temperature rise, always cooling arrangement, it is an important thing in that case, otherwise there is a distortion of that cylinder material. So in these small engines like scooters, motorcycle, the air cooling is provided. So we are increasing the cooling area by providing the number of pins on the engine cylinder. In the next type, that is a water cooling. In the large engines, air cooling it is not sufficient. The water cooling is also there. So water cooling, it is done by the liner, water jacket, or maybe this frame. In this way, total system is there for cooling purpose. So again, when we talking about the liner, there are two types of liner basically we see. That is a dry liner and second is the wet liner. What is mean by dry liner? In the dry liner, actually whatever the cooling water, it is not directly connected with the liner component or your cylinder component, but in the wet liner, your cooling fluid, it is directly connected or directly in contact with the outer surface of the cylinder material or cylinder surface. Next component we see, that is a piston. Again, when we talking about the piston, there are three parts of the piston. That is a top land portion, the middle portion, that is a second land, then the last portion, that is a piston skirt. So top land portion and piston head, this is directly in contact with gas force or whatever the thermal heat generation inside the cylinder, inside the combustion chamber. So we see the functions of this piston. There are different functions performed by the piston. First, it will transmit the force due to the gas pressure inside the cylinder to the crankshaft. Second, it will compresses the gas during the compression stroke. It also work as a seal member, so it will not transmit that gas, exhaust gas to the crankshaft, towards the crankshaft. So it is working like a seal also. It will takes the side thrust. We know that the connecting rod is connected with the piston and crankshaft. So whatever the side thrust develop on the lower side, it should take that thrust from the connecting rod. At the same time, it will dissipate the heat in whatever the heat developed in the engine cylinder, and it has to dissipate that large amount of heat and it will distribute to the remaining portion or remaining components. What are the different material used for the piston? Here we see cast iron, cast steel, forged steel, aluminum steel. These are the different material used for the piston. When we talking about the piston parts, so top portion, that is a piston head, or it is also called as crown. Uh, Generally it is a flat type or maybe concave or convex in shape. This portion, it should be have a high strength, high thermal capacity. It should withstand the gas pressure inside the cylinder. Next component, that is a piston ring. Again we can call it as a compression ring also. It will work as a seal and prevent the leakage of the gas passed to the piston. Oil scraper ring. Oil scraper ring, again it is the lower ring. It is connected in the piston groove, in the upper grooves, in the middle land actually. In the aircraft or maybe in automobiles, 3 to 4 compression rings basically used. Generally in the stationary diesel engines we see 6 to 7 compression rings are there. Oil scraper ring, it is only one for lubricating purpose we are using. So the function of oil scraper rings, it will prevent the leakage of lubricating oil fast to the piston into the combustion chamber. In the upward stroke, it will provide the lubrication to the cylinder, and during the downward stroke, whatever the excess oil, it will absorb that oil, so it will not leak to the combustion chamber also. So these are the functions basically performed by the oil scraper rings. Next part of the piston is skirt. It is the lower portion of the piston, and connecting rod through piston pin, it is connected in this skirt. It is act as a bearing surface for the side thrust exerted by the connecting rod. Next component of the piston is piston pin. It connects the piston to the connecting rod. It is also called as gudgeon pin or wrist pin. Now when we see these different functions of the piston, so what is the design requirement for the piston? Again, first, it should have sufficient strength to withstand the force due to combustion of fuel. Also, inertia force due to reciprocating parts. Second, it should have sufficient rigidity to withstand thermal and mechanical distortion. It should have adequate capacity to dissipate the heat. At the same time, it should have minimum weight, so it has minimum inertia force to reduce the reciprocating motion, which is actually affect on the reciprocating motion. Next is an efficient seal to prevent the leakage of flue gases, sufficient bearing area to take the side thrust and prevent the undue wear of the components. Next we see the component, that is a connecting rod. We know that in the connecting rod, when one end is a small end, that is eye end also we see. Then second is a big end which is connected with our crank web and the middle portion. Now the small end, it is by the piston pin, it is connected with the piston, and the big end by the crank pin, it is connected with the crank or crank web. Most of the connecting rods have a high speed engine have a H or maybe the I section. Functions which are performed by the connecting rods, it will transmit the reciprocating of motion of the piston to the rotary motion of the crankshaft. It also transfers lubricating oil from crank pin to the piston pin and provides a splash or maybe the jet of oil to the piston assembly. So basically it will also provide the lubrication. What are the material basically used for the connecting rod? Nickel chromium steel, medium carbon steel, chromium molybdenum steel. These are the different material basically used for the connecting rod. Next component is the crankshaft. Again, in the crankshaft, crank pin, crank web, shaft, these are the components of the crankshaft. We know that the big end of the connecting rod is connected through crank pin to the crankshaft. The crank web connects the crank pin to the shaft portion. Two types of generally shafts we see, that is a side crankshaft or maybe the center crankshaft. What are the functions basically performed by the crankshaft? It will convert the reciprocating motion of the piston into rotary motion through the connecting rod. The shaft portion rotates the main bearing and they transmit the power to the outside source like gear drive, belt drive or chain drive. What are the different material basically used for crankshaft? That is a plain carbon steel or maybe the alloy steel. It is used as a material for crankshaft. Ball gearing mechanism, this is the next component of IC engine. Main parts of this ball gearing mechanisms are valve, spring, rocker arm, push rod, cam and camshaft. We know that inlet and exhaust valve generally in the part of valve gearing mechanism. Inlet valve, it will allow the air fuel mixture in petrol engine or maybe the air in case of diesel engine. So that is the basic function of inlet valve. Next, the exhaust valve, it will escape the whatever the burn gases through this exhaust valve. Spring, movement of rocker arm and valve is controlled by the spring actually. So timing should be very important. So that is controlled by the spring. Rocker arm, opening of valve due to the oscillatory motion of the rocker arm basically. Push rod transmit the oscillatory motion from the cam to the rocker arm. Cam and camshaft, as we discussed, it will convert the reciprocating motion into rotary motion. So when we are talking about the functions, the function of the valve gearing mechanism, it is timely open and close the inlet and exhaust valve, so we get the high performance of the engine. Then when we talking about the material, inlet valve basically nickel chromium steel. It is used as a inlet valve material. We know that the temperature at the inlet valve, it is less compared to the exhaust valve. Exhaust gases have a high temperature, so silicon chromium steel, generally this material it is used for the exhaust valve. Thank you.